Have you ever wondered what it was really like to be a woman in Japan at the turn of the 20th century? You know, a time caught between huge, sweeping changes and ancient, deep-rooted traditions. Well, today, we're basically opening up a time capsule to find out. We're going to follow the life of a Japanese woman from the moment she's born, through her marriage and beyond, and we'll see it all through the eyes of someone who was actually there, over 120 years ago. All right, let's get into it. So our guide for this whole thing is this incredible book, Japanese Girls and Women, written by an American educator named Alice M. Bacon. Now, what makes her perspective so special is that she had this super rare opportunity to live right alongside Japanese women. That gave her an inside look that was pretty much impossible for any other outsider to get, especially a foreign man. So what we're doing is we're essentially looking over her shoulder into the hidden private world of the Japanese home.
So, what did she actually see? Well, this isn't just going to be a dry history lesson. It's really an exploration of duty, of family, and of this quiet revolution that started when brand new ideas from the West came crashing into centuries of tradition. We're going to follow a woman's life, step by step, just as Bacon wrote it all down.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning, at birth. For a baby girl born in Japan in 1902, her arrival was definitely a cause for celebration. But it also kicked off a life that would be guided by very specific rituals and some really deeply ingrained lessons right from her very first days. So, about a month after she was born, there was this really important ceremony called the Mia Mairi. You can kind of think of it as being a little like a christening. The baby, all dressed up in these beautiful new silks, would be taken to a Shinto temple. There, she was formally placed under the protection of a specific guardian god, and that was for life. It was her official welcome into the spiritual and social world. What's pretty amazing is just how early her moral education began. I mean, from the absolute youngest age, a girl was taught that the most important virtue was self-restraint. The goal was to completely push down her own self, to hide any sadness or anger or pain behind a constant, cheerful smile. She had to learn to always put others first and to show this unwavering, absolute respect for her elders. And this wasn't just about good manners. It was the entire foundation of her identity. Now, as she started to grow up, her education went down two very different paths at the same time. On one hand, you had the traditional arts, all designed to make her a graceful and refined woman. But then on the other hand, there was this new, totally disruptive force popping up, Western-style schooling. And this created a really fascinating split in how a young woman was raised. And right here, you can literally see that cultural collision in action. The traditional path, that was all about etiquette, flower arranging, the tea ceremony, the arts of discipline and harmony. But the new schools, they were teaching math and science and foreign languages. So you ended up with a generation of women who were basically being prepared for two completely different worlds that often went against each other. But hey, a girl's life wasn't all just lessons in self-control. The absolute highlight of her entire year was the Hinamatsuri, which is also known as the Feast of Dolls. For 3 days, the family would bring out its entire collection of ornate dolls. Many of them were these precious heirlooms that had been passed down for centuries. And we're not talking about simple toys here. The centerpiece was always the emperor and empress in their full court outfits. Then, arranged below them, you'd find court musicians and this incredible display of miniature furniture. We're talking tiny lacquered tables, little silver fireboxes, even complete kitchen sets. It was this amazing miniature world that just filled every girl's life with a little bit of magic once a year. So once a girl hit her mid-teens, everybody's thoughts turned to one thing: marriage. But this had very little to do with romance or personal choice. Nope. It was an expectation, a formal transaction that was handled completely by the families. And the whole process was super structured. First, a young man would ask a trusted married friend to act as a go-between to find him a good match. That go-between would then approach the young woman's parents. If they gave the thumbs up, a formal meeting was set up so the two could see each other. And yeah, they both technically had to agree to it, but the whole thing was really guided by family interests and social status, not love. The wedding itself was actually pretty simple and private. There wasn't a big religious service or legal ceremony. The heart of it was this symbolic ritual where the bride and groom would both drink sake from the same cup. This gesture meant that from that day on, they would share everything in life, the good and the bad. After that, the families would just celebrate with a big feast. But get this, there was this really fascinating exception to all the rules. If a family had daughters but no sons, they could adopt a son-in-law, or a yoshi.
This guy would actually give up his own family name, marry the daughter, and become the official heir to her family. So in this one unique case, the roles were totally flipped, and it was the groom who had to get on his new mother-in-law's good side.
So, once she was married, a woman's life entered its most demanding phase. She walked into her husband's home not as an equal partner, but as its newest and very often lowest-ranking member, tied to this strict pecking order of duty. And her number one duty? It wasn't to her husband. It was to his parents. She was expected to serve her mother-in-law before anyone else, basically acting as the family's head servant. To her husband, she was a housekeeper, a valet, but she was never, ever considered his equal or his confidant. Her job was just to manage everything with a smile, no matter how hard it was. This quote from the book, man, it just puts a really heartbreaking human face on all this pressure. A servant named Okiku got married and then came back just 1 month later. She said her husband was kind, he was good to her, but his mother, she was, in her words, simply unbearable and worked her so hard she never had a moment's rest. She ended up getting a divorce, which just goes to show how powerful and crushing the mother-in-law's authority could be. And yeah, Okiku was able to get a divorce. But for most women, especially if they were mothers, it was a completely devastating choice. And the reason why was just stark and brutal. The law gave a woman absolutely zero rights to her own children. Just let that sink in for a second. Her children belonged to her husband's family. Period. She would have to go back to her father's house in disgrace and with no way to support herself. This awful reality forced so many women to put up with even the worst marriages, because the only other option was to lose the most important thing in their lives. And all of this leads us to the great tension of that whole era. This new Western education was creating a new type of woman, one whose mind and her inner world just didn't match the rigid, traditional life she was being forced to live. And this is the real psychological trap at the center of it all. The new schools were teaching women to be intellectual companions, to be partners, but society was still demanding that they be obedient servants. They were being educated for a life that, for the most part, just didn't exist yet in Japan. Can you imagine? This created a quiet personal crisis for a whole generation. These women had sharp, developed minds, but were stuck inside the home. They wanted partnership, but were ordered to serve. Even their modern knowledge about raising children had to be thrown out in favor of a mother-in-law's old-fashioned ideas. And the result, as Bacon saw it, was a generation of women trapped between two worlds, often feeling deeply, deeply unhappy. And so our journey into 1902 Japan leaves us with a pretty tough question, one that really applies to any society that's going through major changes. When you educate women to think for themselves, but you still expect them to live by all the old rules, are you actually creating progress? Or are you just creating a more thoughtful and maybe more painful kind of unhappiness? The lives of these women were the very first test of that question.